All right, hey, I'm Chris, I'm with Tesuto, and I'm going to run through a demo of our UI and our system. So I've just logged into our system, and what I'm presented with is a list of the emulations in my account. So again, each one of these is their own instance of a network. You know, for example, that slide I had that showed North Star, here's where I can actually come in and see it. I can add nodes to it. I can take nodes away. If I say I wanted to link this router with this, pops this up, and I can say, I don't think there's any free interfaces on this device, so that was a bad example. But essentially, it allows you to visually build your network. This is not the only mechanism to do it. If I back up one step here, North Star was there. I can see the list of topologies here. So it's showing me the device, the interface, and where it's mapped. So these are the representations of the physical links of the network. So again, these would all be layer 2 connections for the devices.
Can you import this from your existing configs, or is this
we don't dynamically parse configs today. It's non-deterministic. You can utilize private networks and have the same IPs, so we can't, with any degree of certainty, just based on IP configuration, say this link is connected here.
Right.
We talk about it a lot. I feel like in the future there's going to be more automated ways of doing this. Today it can be represented in YAML or JSON and imported or configured through the visual tool or through this table here. So.
That was actually a question that came up on on Twitter as well, is if you'd allow interface abstraction so that you could test production code. I think that's probably interesting to several people out there.
Well, interface abstraction?
Well, I mean, I think what essentially bringing in your existing config and then saying, okay, well, your router up there doesn't actually have a whatever card slot such and such, but let's just map it to this over here, and let's just make sure we can actually run through and so essentially take my config, parse it, maybe abstract whatever out so that it's still working the same, and see what happens, and then say, yeah, it's working great.
Well, and that'll bring up an interesting question for it in terms of importing things when we get into, pre-production testing like you were talking about as far as your use case. So if I'm grabbing a config from an existing set of routers on there, it's a whole lot more effort if I've got to go edit all the interfaces and take all the other crap out that may or may not.
Well, you don't necessarily have, you can take that config and import it. Now, are we doing a particular validation that says each interface represented in this configuration is represented in the emulation? Ourselves natively, we are not. But certainly, if you're using validation software, whether it be open source, OpenConfig, or Napalm, or you've got a relationship with Forward or Veriflow, our system is complementary to all of those things, such that you could run those same verifications against the production or the emulated network with the production configurations.
Well, it's not so much a verification. It's more of, again, if I'm importing configs just so I can get my topology up and going and test a routing protocol or whatever my end use happens to be for it, for me to think about that on my, again, kind of going into details, on my, Cat 6800, I've got, 2 40 gig interfaces, 14 10 gig interfaces, a bunch of 1 gigs, and what are the names of them and how are they doing, and not having to think about that in terms of, you follow this particular format, which is obviously like a Juniper one up there in that example, but whatever details that we have, is that something that during this process of setting up, on R3, these are the interfaces I have, and here's the way it's specifically named based on what it is, so that I can go and just pull a config and cut and paste.
Yes.
Or to the same point, go from this to prod.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Go the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's do this. Let's set up a device and let me just show you it and let me see. I think it's going to answer your question.
Okay.
And call me out if it doesn't.
So feel free to tell me I'm asking too many questions.
No, you're fine. You're totally fine. So again, when you're creating an emulation, you can clone one of the existing ones. For this one, I'm going to go fresh, US West, since we are. One thing we do support is we do have a full ZTP provisioning engine. So you do have the ability to bring routers up with no configs. We'll do it all. We've got the DHCP, TF, all the back-end stuff is here and will work. And then we also have this concept of Tesuto managed. And what that is if you want, it's a simplification tool. It allows us to put some users in the config and an SSH key so that it makes it easier for you to get to it if there's no config on it and things like that. But if you're bringing up your own routers with your own configs, you can disable it. We don't touch the inside of the router. That's your world. It's pretty much that simple. Okay, so we've got a new emulation. So now let's get straight away into adding a device. So here we go. We've got our devices. Let's go with a good old Juniper here. Again, we've got MXQFX or SRX. I'll just choose MX. We've got various versions here. How about 18? This is our shorthand, so we'd expand this to GE000 through GE0048. And that's how many interfaces would show up in your device.
I have a question on that because I've got an engineering team that we do a lot of independent work, so we're working with a lot of different vendors, and we have an emulation platform. We're running on EVNG right now for my team, but we do this almost all day, every day. And the number of interfaces across different emulation platforms that have existed is a sticking point if you're trying to get to prod. Have you guys been able to solve the ability to run, because a lot of times 12 seems to be a magic number where the VMs just crash and die if you go beyond 12, especially in switching. And I see that you've got up to 48. Is that a challenge you guys have been able to overcome?
Yes and no. I recall in 2017 reading a 1988 PCI bus specification to find out why we couldn't get more.
Yeah.
So we can get a couple hundred.
Okay.
So we've solved it that
So
much.
certainly more than 12.
Yes. Some vendors limit the number of interfaces by default.
Right.
But I'm sure if you have a relationship with them, getting a licensed version without that is trivial. So for most cases, we do not have port limitation issues. But if you do have some giant switch with 2,000 ports, that's a challenge. And it's one we have a plan to overcome, but we haven't done it yet. And that would be to do some physical to logical interface renaming in the configuration that's applied. So taking those physical ports, maybe making them VLAN ports, and doing that dynamically and allowing that to get over. Because there is a very hard PCI bus limit, and we're right up to it. So kind of extending the actual number of interfaces a machine can handle beyond that would be significant. So
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So would you have similar issues, not just with the number of interfaces, but also with maybe the interface type, like the 100 gig interface or 10 gig interface, 40 gig interface?
Well, obviously we're in the cloud, right? So the cloud operators would have to support whatever speed, but in the virtualized world, these are virtual interfaces. So no, not really.
So this seems like it would be very good for testing layer 3 and up type configurations, but like all emulation software that I've seen, not so good at layer 2 testing.
Well, you have full layer 2 connectivity. So if you're looking to test non-IP protocols, you absolutely can.
Right, but I mean just based on, not even based on the ASICs for speed. If you're just looking at, God, how many, what are some of the big, chassis switches capable of? And if you're trying to test 100
more
gig.
layer one.
Yeah, I think
though,
the point is if you're trying to test maybe fib scale, you're going to probably have some issues, right? 'Cause it's more of
Absolutely.
a hardware thing, right? But anytime
Right,
you want to emulate anything at layer 2, like overlays or just pure functionality, this is probably a great tool for that.
Now, that would actually be an interesting question for it, though, is as you get into different devices, your fib scaling kind of hit me on something. Obviously there isn't like a TCAM involved in this because it's emulated.
Right.
Do you have anything to flag how many things that the code is saying push to TCAM, so we could try to count based on this? This is what my router is trying to do, and therefore where I'd run into a problem?
I can say we don't have that.
Okay.
I'm not sure what the technical feasibility is because I just don't know. That's the answer. So,
And that's fine. It's a cool idea. That doesn't mean it's possible. But
right, absolutely. But I can certainly find out.
Thank you.
So. Okay, so we're going to add our device. If I had a config I wanted to apply, a config file, I could upload it here. I can come back and upload it at a later date. So I've got the one device.
So, and just real quick, when you do that, so I notice your kind of regex version of putting that in there for the ports. You're not, it's not giving you any constraint of, obviously I don't care what line card it is, but at the same point I could say, GE 00/48, TE 1/0/,
Well, so there are
something.
templates. So we know what a valid interface looks like for an MX
Okay.
versus a QFX versus an EOS versus, a MikroTik.
Okay.
So there is some kind of, call it rudimentary validation. We know what the maximum number of interfaces we support are. So if that interface range expands beyond the limit, we'll throw you an error. If it's not supported, in that particular device you selected, we'd throw an error.
Okay.
So we definitely try to provide the as many of the kind of notifications and flags about what's happening as we can.
Okay, cool.
I'm noticing the time, so there's a few things I'd like to get to. If this were a cooking show, I would have kind of pieced together my demo emulation there and then said, here's one already done in the oven. But we're going to skip to the done one. So we created this emulation for today. And we put the kitchen sink in it. We wanted all these various vendors. Here's the topology we have set up. So we've got a Linux host hanging off in EOS. The MX is kind of our core router here. And the reason why I bring up the topology is I'd like to show you guys just a little bit of the validation logic here. So in this particular emulation, I've got two validators set up. Okay. I've got an LLDP validator and an ICMP validator. So if I just edit this, here is, again, this is Napalm, YAML-based. So we're making it as friendly as we can, but it's YAML, so there's, it's a little angry by default. So here we're saying we want to run this test on the MX. That's the host name of our Juniper. And here's the params. We want to know that, Gigi 000 is got QFX XE000 connected to it, and iOS XR Gigi is hanging off G001 here in EOS.
So these validators, some of these already built in, or we download?
Yeah, so these are, like for example, this get LLDP neighbors is a Napalm validator. So it's kind of a known function. And what I can do here is show you, what we've tried to do is, here are the built-in Napalm kind of validators. It doesn't stop you from creating your own, but these are the ones. And what we did is we templatized these so that you can come in here and say, okay, if I want to get the v6 neighbors table, here's the information it's looking for to run a validation against that. And so all of these things are kind of templatized as much as we can to make this process as easy. Now, if you've already got a Napalm instance running and you're Ansible on your laptop to your lab device, there's nothing stopping you from doing that exact same thing to the virtual device. And the reason for that is, so all of these devices, when we bring them up, we create, one, their management port accessible to the internet. And I'll talk a little bit about the security of that here, because obviously we don't like exposing stuff. But we create a DNS record for each machine that's publicly resolvable, and it'll always be the host name, the emulation name, the organization name, .cloud.tesuto.com, and we slugify those so they don't have to be DNS friendly. And then the other thing we do is we create a random password for the emulation. So if you're bringing up devices with no configs and you don't want to expose admin to the internet, please don't. If you're allowing us to manage these devices, we will create an account on these devices, and then you can use that to SSH to them or console to them. Just a few more items here. So the way these things run is through what we call jobs. So right now you can see I've got a couple emulations running in interactive. I've got a failed IXIA emulation here. And I've got some that are pending build. Pending build just means they're new. They haven't been started yet. And this goes back to those initialization boot times. It's an indicator to say that no matter what you're cold booting, so whatever's in there is whatever that boot time is, it's the vendor's boot time, and there's not much we can do about it. Once you've booted it up, you can then suspend them. I'll suspend this clone. I can say suspend it an hour, or I could start it at the beginning of the day and say suspend it at 5 p.m. so you don't forget to turn it off before you go home, things like that. So that one will now move to suspended, and that has that MX and all those devices in it, but I'll be able to resume it in 5 minutes if I so desire. So just looking at the jobs is how we manage these things. You can see, maybe if I just make it a touch smaller, there we go. One more. Okay, that's too much, a bridge too far. Shorten this up a bit. So this emulation is the one I have suspending. I've got one in interactive here. This is the one that had those validators I was just looking at. And so the job that ran, I can look at the validation results, and they are slightly backwards. But you can see the first time I ran it, I had a failed validation. And I looked up, and so this was the ping. It was supposed to be pinging 10.111. You know, it got 0 replies. It expected 5. So it had full packet loss. So as a tool in a continuous integration environment, I could have a large number of predefined tests configured and then analyze the job results to see, did all those tests fail? Did they all pass? Did only 1 or 2? And this really becomes, you know, your unit testing of network change code. Going back here, here you've got a full history. Let's look at this one in interactive. You know, we try to expose as much of the data as possible. We've got logs here. So it's basically telling you, and this is most recent first, so it ran the validation across these devices once it came up. There was an error on my Linux box, no surprise. But it essentially goes through the steps of what this emulation has done. Okay, so it started. It's basically Laputas are code name for the code running on the virtualized device. So it brought that up. It went through bringing up the topology, the devices, validating, and then it's sitting in an interactive state. So last thing I want to show, because I'm about to run out of time, is if I go here, and I didn't plan my time well enough to kind of do this in a more complete way, but I want to connect to these devices. So I can SSH to them. We do have SSH keys, API tokens, kind of all of those rudimentary things you'd expect. So straight from my laptop, I could SSH to them. But maybe I just need a quick connection and I don't have a terminal. I can come in here and basically I've got a jump box, and now I can actually console into these routers. So if I've crashed it and it's no longer network accessible, from here I can say console EOS. I logged in. My default username is Tesuto CLI. I copied the password, and I'm in. And once I'm on this prompt, there's really no way to tell that there's a difference between a production device and this one. So
One
that
quick question
console-
before you close out. Are you supporting full functionality of the image? So in other words, iOS XR, XE, whatever, so everything in there from V6 to everything is supported.
absolutely.
Okay.
We put no limitations on it. We're passing V6 traffic in Google data centers that didn't support V6.
Okay.
So, but you said you're running the virtual images that the vendors provide,
100%.
right? So just one thing to be aware of, like a VQFX is a lot different from like a QFX, right? So that
In this case, we're running QFX.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay,
so
so
we
you
have
did-
MX and CMX. So if you want containerized MX
All
versus
right.
MX. So there are distinctions there. We don't have 100% coverage, but
Okay.
again, if there's something you're missing.
Cool. And I know this probably isn't the intended audience for this product, but is this priced in such a way that like individual home users that were preparing for like CCIE or JNCIE could?
I think so.
get this
It's not outrageous.
Yeah.
There's a per minute cost. It's emulated minutes in the cloud, and we're not marking them up. So
Okay.
That reminds me, I know I'm about to get the gaff, but I did bring, for you folks and the folks on the stream, if you'd like to try it out, what we did was we came up with a coupon code. It's got 100 hours. So if you want to go in there and
cool.
kick the tires for 100 hours, it's all yours. I'll hand it out here in a second.
I saw you had licensing on one of those.
Yes.
Hate to ask that question, but
No. That's an important question. So depends on the vendor, but some vendors allow our customers, Tesuto customers, to use their images. But in the case of Cisco, if you want to use a Cisco image, you need a Cisco license. And so there's a tool to verify that you are licensed. And as soon as we know you're licensed, that opens up to you in the UI.
Cool.